This is the current Amtrak network map, and this is the future service map that was released last week. Not only does this map have a bunch of new lines in high-speed rail, but it also has a ton of upgrades for current services. At this moment in American history, the future of rail travel in the United States looks brighter than it ever has been for the last 60 years. So let's dive into the map, let's go through all the new corridors, and let's talk about why this is so important. So let's start out by asking, what is this map? Corridor ID is a program that is run by the Federal Railroad Administration. It was purposely set up to provide funding for new passenger corridors for both Amtrak and private operators. The ID program was made to be able to distribute funds from the bipartisan infrastructure bill that was signed under Biden. Some of those funds are immediately going into certain corridors that are shovel-ready, but a decent amount of those funds were never allocated to anything specifically. So the FRA needed a program to properly distribute the rest of the funding. Corridor ID is there to identify new passenger rail corridors with funds immediately going toward critical studies if a corridor is selected. Usually states or local governments have to foot these bills for these studies entirely, so this money from the FRA can really get projects moving along faster. So does getting Corridor ID money for a study guarantee service? No, but it does give a good fighting chance, especially with the backing of the federal government behind it. It's a lot harder to argue against a service when the feds said it's a good idea in the first place. So with that, let's take a look at where the money is going. And of course, we'll start off with the hottest topic of discussion: high-speed rail funding and corridors. Do you want to experience some of the rail corridors that currently exist in the US without leaving home? Well, thanks to our sponsor today, TrainSim World 4, you can drive trains on some of the most famous routes in the country, like the Antelope Valley line. Not only do they have many different rail corridors in the US, but also tons of different lines and routes throughout the world. In one of the newest expansions of the game, they added 1990s British rail routes from Blackpool to Manchester, featuring the trains that everyone loves to hate, the Pacer. If you would like to take a look at the game for yourself, the links are below. If you're looking for a birthday or Steam gift, this might be the right choice for a friend that loves trains. Thanks to TrainSim World for sponsoring this video. There are 5 different high-speed rail corridors that are either receiving funding for construction or beginning their corridor ID studies. So let's take a look at them. First, we'll start with the 2 lines that are receiving construction funding immediately. California High-Speed Rail is the one that most people are familiar with, but in this update it's receiving roughly $3 billion to continue its construction in the Central Valley. California High-Speed Rail is the furthest along high-speed rail route in the US at the moment, but that might change with our next corridor on the list. Our second high-speed rail route is Brightline West. This is a highly anticipated high-speed rail route, and it will be running in the median of I-15 for most of its way, meaning that it won't make it all the way to LA Union at first. It will actually be stopping in Rancho Cucamonga, where you can take Metrolink all the way back into LA. In this round of funding, Brightline has received $3 billion. This allegedly will allow them to start construction within the year, but we will see. Now to move on to the 3 new high-speed rail routes that are going to be studied as part of this Corridor ID project. Basically what this means is that the government is now handing out money for these studies, but since the feds have basically suggested that this is a good idea, they're more than likely going to move ahead on these projects because there's traction now. Anyway, one of the rail routes that's being studied is Atlanta to Charlotte. Now, being that these are FRA grants for studying a corridor, they're kind of nebulous in what operator could possibly get this corridor. It could be Brightline or Amtrak or maybe a third party that we don't know yet. But these are 2 very important cities that make sense for high-speed rail because of how large their metro areas are and how close they are in proximity. This corridor has been pushed for the last decade by a company known as Texas Central. They essentially want to bring Shinkansen rolling stock from Japan to run between Dallas and Houston. With Amtrak now partnered with them, they now possibly have the ability to expand the scope of the project to extend slightly to Fort Worth, hence why the study also includes high-speed rail from Dallas to Fort Worth. This is one of those obvious corridors that should have high-speed rail, but Texas politics have been forever screwing over any chance of that. Let's hope that changes soon. The Cascades Corridor has been proposed in one way or another multiple different times and with multiple different high-speed rail schemes. This time, the feds are giving the corridor some money to be studied to progress on to getting further funding for construction. The Cascades high-speed rail route has been a little contested as multiple different groups have radically different plans and expectations for the line, but it's nice to see it progressing forward now. Now that we're done talking about new high-speed rail corridors, let's talk about how my construction timeline predictions work. Most of the projects listed on here are not in the construction phase yet, but there are generally ways to figure out how long it might take for a corridor to get shovels in the ground. Here are some very general ways to know if a rail line will get built quickly or not. Generally, a corridor will get built faster if it's government-owned, or it's a Class 2 or 3 railroad that owns the corridor. Other things like the state being Democrat-controlled and the state having a history of rail investment will help if a corridor is running through that certain state. If it's connected to the Northeast Corridor or Chicago, this also helps majorly as Amtrak already has a ton of equipment in the area. And of course, if you have a large population or a large city/metro, then of course, yeah, you're gonna probably get a corridor quicker because there's more people there. If you have the opposite of any of these things, like you're trying to build on Class 1 trackage, the state is Republican controlled, the state has a history of blocking rail investment, or it doesn't connect with multiple other Amtrak services, then yeah, you're going to have a difficult time building a corridor. Are my time frames that I have listed for construction completely accurate? Maybe, but they are a really good educated guess on when these corridors could possibly start or put the shovel in the ground to get everything started. Anyway, let's get on with the corridors now. So, with our first one, this is Ashville to Salisbury in North Carolina. North Carolina has aggressively been pushing for more and more rail within the state, so I have a feeling that this corridor will get done pretty soon. All of the trackage is owned by Norfolk Southern, and it will probably be bought out by the state, but we'll see. This is coming off of the main line from the Piedmont in North Carolina, so it is connecting with other Amtrak services. It last saw passenger service in 1975, so hopefully this will get up and running very soon. The next is a train that should have happened a long time ago, which is Atlanta to Savannah, Georgia. This corridor has been talked about forever, but unfortunately the DOT of Georgia is absolutely shit and has never funded rail projects at all, so hopefully that changes in the future. This is using Norfolk Southern tracks and some Class 3 tracks, so a pretty average corridor. Speaking of Atlanta, here's another one originating from Atlanta. From Atlanta to Chattanooga, the rail is actually state-owned, so that should get completed pretty quickly. But from Chattanooga, Nashville to Memphis, that's all CSX and a mixture of other railroads. So it will be interesting to see when those portions will get completed. But this is a great corridor that I'm looking personally forward to because there's a lot of cool people in that area. New Orleans to Baton Rouge makes a lot of sense, but it'll be interesting to see how long this takes because now the corridor is owned by Canadian Pacific, Kansas City Southern. So I don't know how the politics with that work with Amtrak because they're kind of different now that Canadian Pacific doesn't have to suck up to the FRA to get the merger. So we'll see. I'm going to still guess 3 to 7 years, depending on how long the Mobile train takes. I'm calling this train the Lakeshore Limited Plus, or the Lakeshore Plus. This is basically just adding service to where the Lakeshore Limited runs, which is from Boston to Albany through Springfield. This whole corridor and Massachusetts in general should have a lot more service, and I'm surprised it took this long for Massachusetts to actually get its act together to get this train to run more than once a day. So I'm excited to see this happen, and honestly I'm excited to have more service so that if I need to go visit someone in this area, it will be a lot easier. And for another add-on to a current route, this I'm going to call the Coast Starlight Plus, but it's from San Jose to San Luis Obispo. The North-South California routes connecting LA to San Francisco, aside from California High-Speed Rail, should always have had more service, so it's nice to see that this is finally getting paid attention to. This corridor was originally supposed to be Chicago to Iowa City, but instead it's now Chicago to the Quad Cities or Moline Davenport area. The reason why it's not all the way to Iowa City is because the railroad that's connecting Moline or Davenport to Iowa City is called the Iowa Interstate, and they do not want to play ball with any passenger rail at the moment for many different reasons. But one of the main reasons is that the owner does not like positive train control, and he's doing anything in his power to fight having to have any sort of positive train control on any of his lines. And they really only have really one main line, and that's what this passenger train wants to use. So if you do want a passenger train from Chicago to Iowa City, and it's probably using the Iowa Interstate main line, then they're probably going to have to take Iowa Interstate Railroad probably to court or something. I don't know. Or there's going to be some background deals to figure out something. But that's why it's not going all the way to Iowa City. I'm aptly naming this corridor the Rust Belt Limited because it's basically going through the core of the Rust Belt. And with this, there's a lot of cities that it's hitting in between. I'm probably guessing that this is going to be a daily train, maybe, or maybe 2 round trips a day. Unfortunately, because this is running on both CSX and Norfolk Southern tracks, possibly, it could take a long time to get constructed, and also because it goes through Indiana, and Indiana doesn't have a good history of funding rail projects. But let's hope that's not the case, and it's on the lower end of the amount of time between now and when it starts running. Speaking of Ohio, one of the most anticipated corridors in the bunch is the 3Cs plus D corridor, which basically connects all of Ohio. I'm really hoping that this gets finished pretty quickly because this is probably one of the most useful new routes that Amtrak could have in the country. So let's hope that Ohio can get it together. Another Ohio corridor is the Cleveland to Toledo to Detroit corridor, which is very important and historically was a New York Central service. But since this is now using a CSX and NS mixture of trackage, it will be interesting to see how long it will take to put together. I'm not exactly sure what's envisioned with the Coachella corridor, but it will be interesting to see what the study comes up with. If Colorado actually invested in rail all the way back in the day until now, it could be the Switzerland of the United States. But since that's not the case and they're trying to get there again, let's hope that these projects like the Front Range Corridor project succeed, because if there's one state that really needs rail access, it's definitely Colorado. Virginia and North Carolina are sort of in a friendly competition to see who can develop an intercity rail system before the other one. Virginia wants to continue this trend with the Commonwealth Corridor that will stretch from east to west across the state. I'm hoping that it does get finished because this will help a lot of the connectivity in the area, especially for the Richmond area. Technically, the corridor ID system, when they award a corridor, doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be Amtrak, so possibly some of these corridors could be a commuter rail agency, such as this one in Delaware, or on the Delmarva Peninsula. Either way, I'm excited to see something that's another branch off of the Northeast Corridor. Plus, I have family down there, so it'll be interesting to finally take a train down there and not have to drive. These two corridors go hand in hand because they basically go to the same place, both from Chicago to the Twin Cities. The Empire Builder Plus, as I'm calling it, is basically just running more trains on the same route as the Empire Builder between Chicago and the Twin Cities. On the pessimistic end, it would take 5 to 10 years, but it's allegedly going to start running in about 1 to 2. We'll see. Yeah, I think these are fantastic services that I both look forward to seeing running. Back to North Carolina for a second. I forgot that we had a corridor that actually got funding that was something that was other than high-speed rail, which is the North Carolina to Virginia S-Line. The S-Line basically allows for trains to get to Raleigh a lot faster than they would have otherwise, because instead of having the deviation that you have to do over and then back from Washington, D.C., you can now go directly from Richmond to Raleigh, basically. Part of the S-Line had an abandoned section, so they're fixing the abandoned section and upgrading the other sections that exist currently. This video is getting long, so we're going to try to rapid fire some of these off. This is the Gulf Coast service, which should start in a few years. Houston to San Antonio. The I-20 corridor will be interesting because it's supposed to be 110 mile an hour on many sections of the rail because it's very straight. Florida has the long-distance Amtrak trains, but also Amtrak is looking into putting local services or regional services in Florida itself, so you don't have to rely on the long-distance passenger stuff. Unless Indiana has a different change of heart with how they fund rail, I don't see this happening anytime soon, but let's hope that's not the case, and let's hope that I'm being pessimistic on this. The long-distance route study is an entirely different study, but this corridor has been announced, which is the North Coast Hiawatha, which used to be an Amtrak train in the 1970s, but unfortunately got canceled. Minneapolis to Duluth should happen pretty soon, since the state is very supportive of it. The Phoenix to Tucson corridor has been announced, mainly to send trains through downtown Phoenix, where they currently do not go. Here's a local one to me that I'll be talking about more in the future, but here's Reading to Philadelphia, which I'm very, very much looking forward to. And for this project, I really would suggest rebuilding the Kenwood line over the Manayunk Bridge to connect it to 30th Street, but that's a topic for a future video. And of course, the Scranton corridor, which I'm also very much looking forward to, and have done a video that you can find here. Also, if you want any information about the Scranton corridor, I would refer to you to Chuck Walsh or the Lackawanna Cutoff channel that you can find on YouTube. Raleigh to Wilmington is using CSX track and restoring some abandoned sections. And finally, our last corridor is the Peoria to Chicago corridor. If you're wondering why it feels like there's some corridors that are missing from the map here or weren't in this video, it's because there are. There are a decent amount of services that are getting extensions, and I didn't really count them as new corridors. So if you're looking for like Amtrak to Ronkonkoma or something like that, then I will be talking about that in a separate video on my second channel. So make sure you're subscribed over there if you want to see that. If you're on my Patreon, I will thank you right now. You guys are keeping me sane when I make videos like this, where I spend a ton of time, and I know it's not necessarily going to be the most interesting video in the world for the general audiences out there to pick it up. So, thanks to my Patreons. They'll be getting that extra corridor video earlier, and then it will be posted on my second channel. Otherwise, thanks to them. Thanks to Train Sim World 4 for sponsoring this video, and I hope to see you guys in the next one.